You are listening to U-Boat Massacre, the case of U-852, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This is an audio program for War Stories with Mark Felton. On only one documented occasion during the Second World War was a German U-boat skipper responsible for the cold-blooded murder of unarmed Allied merchant seamen after he had sunk their ship. In this particular case, known as the Peleus Massacre, the officers responsible for the murders were subsequently tried and convicted. On the 13th of March 1944, U-852, under the command of 35-year-old Lieutenant Commander Heinz Wilhelm Eck, intercepted the 4,695-ton Greek merchant ship Peleus in the South Atlantic. The steamship Peleus had been built in Hartlepool in England in 1928 and acquired by a Greek shipping line. During World War II, the Peleus sailed under a charter from the British government, transporting supplies across the Atlantic. Of her 35 crew, 18 were Greek, including the captain, 8 British, 3 Chinese, 2 Egyptian, and 4 Russian. Lieutenant Commander Eck had joined the German Navy in 1934 and first commanded a U-boat in June 1943. His mission aboard U-852 in March 1944 was top secret, as the Germans sent their special long-range Type 9 U-boats to hunt in the Indian Ocean and disrupt Britain's sea lanes supplying her far-flung empire. Eck had tracked the Peleus until darkness had fallen. Then, after closing up the range between his U-boat and the merchantman, he had fired 2 torpedoes at her whilst surfaced. The Peleus was completely ripped apart by the detonations, which killed perhaps half of the crew, and the ship abruptly sank. For the survivors, left clinging desperately to wreckage or life rafts, no one expected what followed from a German submarine. U-852 slowly nosed into the field of debris. It appeared from his post-war interrogation that Eck was primarily interested in recording his kill and required the name and tonnage of the ship in order to do so. 2 survivors were hauled aboard the U-boat and the necessary information recorded before they were returned to the water unharmed. Eck then told the survivors to turn off all the lights fitted to their survival equipment and life rafts in order to give his U-boat a head start in exiting the vicinity before Allied ships arrived. This was a ruse, however, although Eck argued at his post-war trial that he had ordered his men to open fire with machine guns in order to sink the remaining large pieces of wreckage, including the life rafts, in order that no evidence of the sinking should be discovered, but this was rejected as a fabrication. It appears that Eck was concerned that any seamen who were rescued by the Allies would betray the presence of his U-boat in the South Atlantic, a fact which he wished to conceal as thoroughly as possible. U-boats were under orders from the commander of the German Navy, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, not to take survivors on board, for the simple reason that space and provisions would not permit such humanitarian gestures. Dönitz had issued several orders forbidding displays of humanity lest commanders unnecessarily risk their boats, so survivors were always left to fend for themselves, many never to be picked up. On this occasion, Eck ordered machine guns, MP-40 machine pistols, and stick grenades to be brought topside, and for the next 5 hours he mercilessly cleaned up the scene of the sinking, with most of the survivors from the Peleus being shot to death in the water. Even the U-boats' 37 and 20mm anti-aircraft guns were turned on the helpless men in the water. To add to the disgrace, U-852's medical officer took part in the massacre. Eventually, Eck lost interest in attempting to sink the life rafts, which were remarkably resistant to machine gun bullets, and U-852 slunk away into the night. It was only because 3 men survived the massacre and a further 49 days adrift before being rescued by a Portuguese neutral that this heinous crime became known to the Allied authorities. Eck and the U-852 sank another cargo ship, the SS Dahomean off Cape Town, South Africa, on the 1st of April 1944, but did not linger to kill survivors. The British finally caught up with the U-boat on the 30th of April, when a Royal Air Force Wellington bomber flying from Aden damaged the submarine with depth charges off the coast of Somalia. U-852 was run aground, and 58 of the 65 crews survived to make it ashore, where they were captured by the Somaliland Camel Corps and sent to prison camps. Eck's actions were universally condemned by the U-boat service, and personally by Dönitz himself at the Nuremberg war crimes trial. At his trial in Hamburg in the autumn of 1945, Eck argued in his defense that he had ordered his crew to disperse floating wreckage with machine gun fire, and that any civilian deaths among the survivors were accidental or the result of the overzealous following of his orders by his crew. On the 17th of October 1945, Eck was found guilty of war crimes, along with U-852's executive officer, Lieutenant August Hoffmann, the chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Hans Lenz, the medical officer, Lieutenant Dr. Walter Weisspfennig, and a leading seaman, Wolfgang Schwender, were also found guilty. Lenz was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Schwender to 15 years. Schwender was released from prison on parole in 1951 and Lenz in 1952. Eck, Hoffmann and Weisspfennig were sentenced to death and executed by a British firing squad on the 30th of November 1945. The action by Eck was the only known massacre carried out by the German Navy's U-boat service during the Second World War, and was widely condemned throughout the German military after the war. Dönitz resisted Hitler's idea of killing unarmed merchant ship survivors as a method of wearing down the Allied war machine as dishonourable to the Navy. However, the German example of this kind of behaviour does demonstrate that German naval officers and men could commit outrages against the laws of war in the same way as their Japanese allies. What set them apart was the general unwillingness of the vast majority of officers to accept such a massacre doctrine as a legitimate method of fighting the enemy. Unfortunately, Allied propaganda from the Second World War has proved hard to eradicate from the truth of what happened, and erroneous stories of German U-boats machine-gunning defenseless Allied seamen have remained embedded in the public consciousness. Notably, recent films, for example U-571, have perpetuated this myth in order to demonize what was essentially the least brutal of the various military forces of World War II Germany. The evidence for this form of crime simply does not exist, and the punishments given to Eck and his companions were widely applauded by former U-boat men at the time and long afterwards. Interestingly, evidence has emerged that British and American submarines also committed war crimes against shipwreck survivors. HMS Torbay, a T-class submarine, was involved in 2 incidents in the Mediterranean. Twice after sinking ships, the skipper, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Myers, ordered crewmen to shoot at survivors in the water. He even reported these actions in his log. In response, Myers received a strongly worded reprimand from the Royal Navy. Myers was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his exploits against Axis convoys, and his bravery and skill as a submarine skipper. The USS Wahoo, a Gato-class submarine under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, was a highly successful submarine in the Pacific War. Morton was investigated for deliberately firing on survivors of a Japanese ship he had just sunk, the Buyomaru, claiming that Japanese in lifeboats opened fire on the Wahoo with a machine gun. In fact, most of the survivors were Indian prisoners of war from the 16th Punjab Regiment. Both the actions of Myers and Morton appear to have been unique cases in each Allied navy. And by and large, with the exception of Japanese submarines, submariners of both the Allied and Axis navies observed the rules of war and behaved accordingly, making outrages like the Peleus massacre the exception rather than the rule. You have been listening to U-Boat Massacre, the case of U-852, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This was an audio program for War Stories with Mark Felton. For videos on a wide variety of military history subjects, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions, details below. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.